Hello, people of the internet, and welcome back to the What If There Was No Video Game Crash of 1983 series. We're at the fourth part now, and I have to say it's the final part. So thank you for sticking with us throughout the entire series. But we're going to go straight into it to year 1995, when we have to say goodbye to Magnavox after all their years in the video game industry because they've simply run out of ideas. I'll get onto that later. And as for Sega, they're developing something with another company. We'll get onto that later too. But let's look at the two companies that have released consoles between the years 1991 and 1995. They are the Atari company, with the Atari Jaguar, and the 3DO company, with the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer. But let's look at the 3DO first. It's probably the more interesting of the two. There was a man called Trip Hawkins who founded Electronic Arts. But after a while he grew dissatisfied at Electronic Arts, claiming that the company was going in a bad direction. And I have to say, I can't really blame him. He was pretty damn right. So he left and he founded his own company. He called it the 3DO Company. First you had audio, then you had video, and then you had 3DO. Yeah. The 90s was the decade for bad puns. But he had the idea that if you teamed up with hardware companies to make the hardware for your company, and you had a company to make the software for the system, then it would sell really well. And while this might seem like a good idea on paper because you're getting good consoles and you're also getting good software for the consoles, there's a catch. Remember when I said in my first part of the series that unless you were making software for the console that you were making, you weren't going to get any profit out of it? And this is the case for Panasonic, Goldstar, and Sanyo. They're not making any games for these consoles. 3DO are. And as such, Panasonic, Goldstar, and Sanyo, if they want to make any profit off of this, are going to have to make it off the console. And the consoles then are going to be extremely high in terms of price. And this is why the 3DO failed in the real events, and this is why it's going to fail in our altered events. So let's look onto the console that has the better chance of succeeding. This console is the Atari Jaguar. And while everyone was involved in a pissing war over whose bits and bytes were better, Atari took the world by storm and announced a 64-bit console. That's like twice the bits of the 3DO. What a console. Yeah, only except one thing. It actually wasn't 64-bit. I mean, technically, yeah, it was, but it wasn't a 64-bit processor. Instead, it was a mix-mash of different, smaller processors that somehow added up together to give us 64 bits of processing power. And this is a bad thing, especially for developers, because it alienated them. The Jaguar was extremely difficult to develop for, and as a result, not many games got made for the console. And this was a pretty big detriment to the Jaguar, and mainly why it failed in the real events. But having said that, there are good things to take away from the Jaguar. For instance, Alien vs Predator, Iron Soldier, and Tempest 2000 are all excellent Atari Jaguar exclusives. And Rayman, Doom, and Wolfenstein 3D all ran smoother on the Jaguar than on any other console around at the time. And now in our altered events, Atari also have a lot of publishing support. They have Activision, who never left them in the first place, Infogrames, a French company who are taking a lot of interest in Atari and a potential team-up between the two, Ubisoft, who developed Rayman, and id Software, who are using the Atari Jaguar for Doom and Wolfenstein, when it's running smoother on their console than on any other console out at the time. So, with this potential team-up, yeah, it could take down Philips. So here we go. Yeah, Philips can make the argument that Pac-Man World for the CDI is better than Trevor McFarlane and the Crescent Galaxy on the Atari Jaguar, but the trouble is that Philips are only going to write off Pac-Man World. Atari, meanwhile, on the other hand, are going to go back. They're going to come out with a game like Rayman, which is much better than Pac-Man World, and Philips won't have a response, and this is why they're going to have to bow out of the industry ultimately. But is there any competition for Atari? Obviously, you know the answer. Yes, there is. What's the competition? It comes in the form of Sega's latest project, the Sega PlayStation. Yeah, I know. But how do we arrive at this? Well, I'll explain. See, in the real events, after Sony were publicly humiliated at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1993 by Nintendo, they went to Sega, Nintendo's most bitter rivals, and agreed that they would make a CD-based console together. This would be the PlayStation. And while it was going well initially, Sega brought it to their up highs, and then they rejected the idea. They said that Sony didn't know how to make hardware or software, and that entering into a deal with them would be a disaster for the company. There would be no reason for them to do it. And while technically this was a bad decision, it was also technically a good decision, because most electronic companies at the time had a notorious reputation for making terrible consoles. NEC made the TurboGrafx 16, which, while it wasn't a terrible console, was still a failure. The 3DO is the same. While it technically wasn't a bad console, it was a pretty big failure. And the Philips CDI, which, as we all know in our real events, turned out to be a disaster. But in our altered events, where 2 of the 3 of those are actually successes, it makes sense why Sega would want to team up with Sony. But why would Sony want to enter into the video games industry? Simple. Philips. Philips are Sony's biggest rivals in electronics making. And so, when Philips becomes successful in video games, Sony are going to want a piece of the pie too. And who better to go to than Magnavox's biggest rivals in the video game industry, Sega. And this gives us the Sega PlayStation. There's going to be major advantages to this. And that's that while Activision, id, Infogrames, and Ubisoft are all going to go to the Jaguar, Sony are much more open. And this is why the PS1 succeeded in areas where other electronics company consoles failed. Because Sony acknowledged that they didn't know what they were doing when it came to video games. And as such, at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1994, where Sony unveiled the PlayStation, they had a platform for developers who wanted to get their games out on consoles but simply couldn't at the time because not enough platforms were open and inviting. They had a booth for them where they could register their games as part of Sony Computer Entertainment. And this worked brilliantly for Sony because they got a load of brilliant developers. And this is why the PlayStation succeeded in the real events. They're also going to get the commanding majority of third-party support now because their platform uses CDs while Atari simply doesn't. And not only this, it's going to have the combined power of the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. So while they're going to get games like Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy VII, and Parappa the Rapper, they're also going to get games like Nights into Dreams, Panzer Dragoon, and Virtua Fighter, which made the Sega Saturn popular. But as always, there is competition. Atari are going to be back. Let's look at this company called Microsoft. This is the year 1997, and a year where they should be entering into an agreement with Sega to develop a console that uses Windows as its main platform. And this console will be the Dreamcast, but now in an alternate timeline where Sega are currently working with Sony, Microsoft are going to need another partner. And this partner turns out to be Atari, you guessed it. This gives us the Xbox. And this is going to be pretty good because Microsoft have their developers Rare now, and Atari have their team of developers too. But what's going to sell the system? Xbox Live, online gaming. The idea that you could play a game with someone, and even though you're technically alone, you could play it with them. This is going to give way to something I'm pretty sure you'll all know is popular today. The first-person shooter genre. Yeah, this is going to attract a lot of support, because a lot of the first-party devs are making first-person shooters. For instance, Activision made Call of Duty. Activision are part of Atari. Atari are first party. id Software, also part of Atari, making games for the Xbox. Same with Wolfenstein, made by Atari. Halo, made by Bungie. Microsoft are Bungie. Counter-Strike, made by Valve. And while technically, yeah, Valve are their own third-party developers, Microsoft had the Xbox Live to be the PC console. And as such, games like Counter-Strike are going to get released for it. And now we finally have a console war. The PlayStation 2 versus the Xbox. Just like in our real events. And this is going to go on and on until we finally reach 2016. And then there's arguments being put forward. For instance, Grand Theft Auto 5, a PS4 exclusive in the alternate events, is going to be compared to Assassin's Creed Syndicate, an Xbox exclusive in our alternate events. The same thing with Sonic Mania and Rayman Legends, or Killzone Shadowfall in Black Ops 3, or Uncharted 4 in Rise of the Tomb Raider. And so, yeah, it's pretty much like our real events. Games which are very similar being compared, only down to the fact that they're being released on different platforms. And this is finally where we end the series. Thank you for watching it, and stay tuned next time for a series that I'm going to do. I've been with the man with a plan, and thank you for watching.